Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere quiet, somewhere slow, somewhere wrapped in silk stockings and cigarette smoke and the particular hush of old money. We are stepping into the world of the wealthy American woman of the 1950s. Not the actresses, not the names you already know, but the ones who lived just outside the spotlight, in houses with more rooms than people, with staff who knew their secrets better than their own sisters did, and with a calendar so full that idleness, real idleness, was something they almost never got to feel. Before we drift any further, if you're enjoying this kind of slow, detailed history, go ahead and subscribe. It really does help keep this channel going. And if there's an era or a topic you'd love to hear covered like this, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. If you'd rather listen on Spotify while you drift off, that link is in the description too. Now get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop. Tonight you don't need to hold on to anything. Let it all go and let's begin. Picture it. 1954. A large house on a quiet street, the kind with a circular driveway and hedges trimmed into perfect right angles. Somewhere behind those walls, a woman is waking up, and her day, though nobody would ever call it labor, is about to begin in earnest. What did it actually feel like to be a woman of means in post-war America? To have a cook, a housekeeper, a nanny, a husband who vanished each morning at 8 and reappeared at 6 expecting the house to be exactly as he left it, only better. Was there boredom behind the pearls? Was there sharp intelligence folded up small enough to fit inside a napkin ring? Was there a woman in there, underneath all that composure, who sometimes wondered what her life might have looked like if it belonged entirely to her? You are about to find out. Because tonight, you are her. It is 1954. You are lying in a bed with sheets that were changed yesterday by someone else's hands. Your hair was set the night before. Your children are already awake somewhere down the hall, being tended to by people who are paid to tend to them. And your day, blank as it looks on the surface, is already spoken for in ways you have spent years learning to accept. The architecture of a morning waking up in this world was never really waking up. It was closer to an unveiling. The process began the instant your eyes opened, whether the clock read 7 or whether a soft knock at the door told you it was time. There was no such thing as simply getting up. There was only the beginning of construction. First came the face, always before your husband saw it. The overnight cold cream had to be wiped away, the skin toned, and only then could the real work start. Foundation smoothed on with careful fingers, powder set to hold it, a brow pencil filling in what nature had left unfinished, and finally lipstick, in a shade you had likely worn for the better part of a decade because it was correct, and correctness was not a thing one experimented with on an ordinary Tuesday. Then came the hair. The pin curls set the previous evening under a silk scarf now had to be unwound, brushed, and coaxed into the soft, rounded wave that was the visual shorthand for a woman entirely in control of her circumstances. It took the better part of 40 minutes, sometimes longer, and the goal, paradoxically, was to look as though none of it had taken any time at all. Effortlessness was the product. Effort was the well-hidden manufacturing process behind it. Only after the face and the hair were finished did the house dress go on, not casually chosen but pressed the evening before, belted at the waist, because in this decade a waistline was treated almost as a moral position, evidence of self-command. By the time you sat down at the breakfast table, you had already spent the better part of an hour and a half preparing to be seen, and you had not yet made a single decision anyone would consider significant. And yet, in a strange way, the day had already begun asking things of you. Breakfast itself carried its own quiet choreography. You did not cook it. Somewhere in the kitchen, a woman you employed had been at work since well before dawn, and the small diplomatic dance between you and her, how much direction to give, how much to withhold, was a skill refined over years. Too much guidance and you were meddling. Too little and any mistake, however small, would somehow still trace back to you. You reviewed the day's menu, approved it or adjusted it slightly, and returned to the table where your husband sat with the newspaper, his eggs prepared exactly the way he liked them, A preference so well known in the household it no longer required stating out loud. Your own preference mattered considerably less. Breakfast in this house was not really about you. It was about the smooth continuation of a system that had been running long before you arrived at the table and would keep running long after you left it. The coffee was poured from the good pot, not the everyday one, because even an unremarkable Tuesday morning was expected to meet a certain standard. The toast sat upright in a silver rack rather than flat on a plate, because soft toast was considered, in this world, something close to an embarrassment. Somewhere in the kitchen, two women negotiated an unspoken hierarchy. The cook, who had claimed the stove and the pantry as her domain since 7 that morning, and the housekeeper, who arrived an hour later to lay claim to the rest of the house. If their territories overlapped, if the housekeeper's dusting schedule collided with the cook's rhythm, it fell to you, quietly and without fanfare, to smooth it over. You knew their family situations. You asked warmly whether the cook's daughter had passed her examinations, whether the housekeeper's husband had recovered from whatever illness had kept him home the week before. You held both real affection and careful distance at once, a calibration so old you'd absorbed it as a child simply by watching your own mother do the same thing without ever once nomming it. At 8:45, your husband folded his newspaper to the business section, kissed you on the cheek, or did not, depending on the temperature of the marriage that particular week, and left. The front door closed. The house, for a few hours, became yours to occupy, though occupying it was a very different thing from owning it in any way that granted you real freedom. By then, the cook had already turned her attention to lunch. You had a committee meeting at 10. The children needed to leave for school within the half hour. The grapefruit sat half-finished on good china, and somewhere inside the smoothly oiled machine of the household, you existed under a title, wife, that was enormous in its demands and almost invisible in its recognition. Children. Loved from a careful distance, wealthy mothers in the 1950s adored their children deeply and unmistakably, but the affection operated at a specific remove, the way one might adore a painting hanging in a room they didn't spend much time in. The nanny handled the actual mechanics of mourning, waking the children, dressing them, feeding them, delivering them to school with an efficiency that made the whole operation look, from a distance, effortless. You appeared briefly. A kiss on the forehead. A question about how the night had gone. A gentle note about the day's plans. Then you withdrew back into the adult hours of the house. This wasn't coldness, not exactly. It was simply the accepted shape of things. Close, hands-on parenting was, in this social tier, associated with women who could not afford to do otherwise. And you very much could afford otherwise. The nanny occupied a strange position in the household's ecosystem. She knew things about your children that you often didn't, whether your son had trouble sleeping, whether your daughter fought over breakfast, whether the children asked for you during the day and in what tone, anxious or merely habitual. These were not conversations you had in any depth, because depth would have required examination, and examination did not fit neatly into a Wednesday that already had a luncheon scheduled for 12:30. Real time with your children arrived in the late afternoon, between 4 and 5:30, after they'd been bathed and calmed by the day's end. This was when you sat with them in the nursery, read aloud if they were still young enough to want it, asked about their day with genuine interest tempered by the slight formality of someone working from second-hand information. There was also the nightly ritual before dinner, when the children came downstairs in pajamas to say good night, a moment that was sincerely touching and also, if you were honest with yourself, a small performance, the portrait of a perfect family assembled for exactly as long as it took to be admired. Then the nanny took them back upstairs, and you went to refresh your lipstick before cocktail hour, and the house shifted back into the register it occupied for most of its waking life, the adult one. The full-time occupation of being seen. If you assume wealthy women of this era spent their days in idle comfort, you have badly underestimated how much structure and how much exhaustion a life without paid employment could still demand. The social calendar functioned as a genuine occupation, tracked with the seriousness of a small logistics operation. There were luncheons. There were teas. There were committee meetings for the hospital, for the symphony, for the garden club, for whichever charitable cause had recently been adopted by women in your particular social bracket. None of this was optional in any meaningful sense. Attendance was noted. Absences were noticed and eventually questioned. Miss a luncheon once and you were simply busy. Miss it twice and people began to wonder why. Miss it a third time and you had quietly begun to slip out of the loop, a form of social erosion that moved slowly but was remarkably difficult to reverse once it started. The calendar itself lived in a leather-bound book, kept with the precision of a scheduling department. First Tuesday of the month, the luncheon. Alternate Wednesdays, the symphony committee. Thursday afternoons, bridge, which functioned as a socially acceptable cover for 3 hours of sitting in the same room monitoring the general temperature of your world. A scheduling conflict was treated as a genuine crisis, not because any single event mattered enormously on its own, but because the consequences of skipping things compounded quietly over time. You attended events that bored you nearly to sleep and performed genuine interest with the skill of a career diplomat. You planned which outfit could serve for both Tuesday's luncheon and Wednesday's meeting, and which required 2 entirely separate ensembles because the same people would see you at both. You decided whether the hostess deserved flowers sent before the event or after, whether a note needed to be handwritten or whether a phone call would suffice. And the answer was almost always handwritten, because handwriting proved you had made the time, and making the time was, in the end, the entire point. By Friday, you might have attended 4 events, written half a dozen notes, made more than a dozen decisions about your appearance, and managed at least one scheduling conflict, all while wearing the calm, unbothered expression of a woman who found the whole thing effortless. You had not found it effortless. Effortlessness was simply the performance, and the performance was not negotiable. The wardrobe as a filing system for an entire identity getting dressed in this world was never a matter of opening a closet and reaching for whatever felt comfortable that day. It was a structured negotiation between the occasion, the season, the audience, and an entire unwritten code of rules that every woman in your circle had absorbed so thoroughly it no longer felt like a code at all. It simply felt like knowing how to live. The morning house dress was distinct from the luncheon suit, which was distinct from the afternoon ensemble, which was distinct again from the cocktail dress, and further still from the evening gown, an entirely separate category with its own grammar. White gloves appeared for certain occasions and were absent for others, and understanding precisely which occasions demanded them, and what length was appropriate, functioned as a kind of cultural literacy, one that instantly separated the women who belonged from the women who were still learning the rules. Hats followed their own logic. Shoes had to match with precision. Handbags were coordinated and never oversized, because a large handbag implied you might be carrying something you needed for yourself, and needing things for yourself undercut the whole presentation. Your closet was not casual storage. It was archived, organized by category and by season with the meticulous attention of a professional collection. Winter suits occupied one section, day dresses another, and the cocktail dresses lived in a cedar closet wrapped in tissue paper, because fabric, you understood, had enemies, and you did not intend to let them win. Shoes sat in their original boxes, each one photographed on the outside so you could locate a pair without dismantling the entire system. Hats rested on stands along the upper shelf. Gloves were sorted by color and by the precise occasion they were meant for. Dressing for any single event required real lead time, and not because you were indecisive, but because the correct outfit was a calculation involving several variables at once. Who else would likely be there, and what did they typically wear? What was the hostess's aesthetic? And should you compliment it or simply avoid clashing with it outright? What was the weather doing, since that dictated fabric? Had you worn this particular dress recently in front of an overlapping audience, because repeating an outfit in front of the same eyes was a risk you managed with real deliberation. Shopping in this life was itself a kind of event. You held accounts at the good department stores and maintained relationships with specific saleswomen on the upper floors, women who knew your size, your coloring, your preferences, and who telephoned personally when something arrived that seemed suited to you. You did not browse in the ordinary sense. You were shown things, you evaluated them, and you decided. Alterations were simply expected, because a dress worn straight off the rack without adjustment was, in this world, something close to an admission that your body was merely average, and nothing here was permitted to be average. The pressure behind all of this was constant, low grade, and almost entirely invisible from the outside. Nobody handed you a written rule demanding you dress a certain way. Nobody issued a penalty for a misstep. The enforcement lived instead in a slight pause before a compliment that should have come immediately, in a fractional shift in someone's expression, in the small, telling absence of a comment where a comment would ordinarily have been offered. Your wardrobe was the first sentence you spoke each day, before you'd said a word out loud, and you could not afford for that sentence to be wrong. Lunch, where the real business of the world was conducted if the dinner parties were where reputations were displayed. The luncheons were where they were actually built, maintained, and occasionally quietly dismantled. Not at the grand evening events, but at the impeccably set tables of private clubs and wood-paneled restaurants, where women gathered in groups of 4 or 5, ordered chicken and a glass of white wine, and in the space of 90 minutes conducted the genuine social business of their entire world. Who was struggling? Whose husband had been seen somewhere he shouldn't have been? Whose daughter had become a quiet source of concern? Which family had recently done something that required the community's collective processing? None of this was ever called gossip, a word reserved for smaller, less careful minds. This was described, if it needed describing at all, as staying informed, as maintaining the social fabric that held the entire community together. You arrived at precisely the right time, not early, which suggested eagerness, and not late, which suggested disorganization, but at the exact moment that communicated ease without carelessness. You greeted the others with warmth calibrated for people you had known 15 years and saw 3 times a week, genuine but never effusive, friendly but never loud. You were shown to your usual table, or close enough to it, and you ordered without consulting the menu, because consulting it would have suggested either unfamiliarity with the restaurant or genuine indecision, and neither was acceptable. Underneath the surface conversation, the children, the husbands, the upcoming plans, ran an entirely different current, moving at a different speed. This was where you learned that a marriage in your circle was rockier than it appeared from the outside. This was where you learned a family's finances had shifted in a direction not yet made public. This was where you learned which detail from last week's dinner party had become the thing everyone was quietly discussing, and whether the woman at the center of it knew she was being discussed at all. None of it arrived directly. It came instead in half-finished sentences, in questions that sounded innocent but weren't, in a pause after someone's name that stretched a beat too long and communicated volumes, depending on exactly how long that beat lasted. You were fluent in this language because you had been listening to older women speak it since you were young enough to be brought along to these lunches yourself, absorbing slowly the understanding that what looked like pleasant chatter was, underneath, a highly compressed and precise form of communication. You ate roughly half your plate, the wine glass emptied. The thank you note, if the lunch had been hosted, would be written that evening. And by 2 in the afternoon you were back in the car, carrying information you would use, some of it immediately and some of it months down the line, planted now like seeds for a harvest you couldn't yet picture. The committee as an outlet for everything else. Every wealthy woman of this era belonged to at least one club and chaired at least one committee, and the sheer volume of energy poured into these committees was often wildly out of proportion to their practical output, though that was never quite the point. The garden club met monthly to discuss matters that could have been resolved in a 5-minute conversation and would nonetheless be discussed for 4 times as long as necessary. The hospital auxiliary raised funds and coordinated volunteers and gave many of these women a sense of purpose. Their domestic lives did not reliably supply on their own. The symphony board meant season tickets, opening night dinners, and a persistent, comfortable sense of supporting something cultured and worthwhile. These organizations were not without real substance. They accomplished genuine things, but they also functioned as the socially acceptable container for the ambition of women who were not permitted to have careers and who needed somewhere to direct considerable intelligence and organizational skill so that it did not become, in the language of the era, inconvenient. The meetings followed a structure nearly as reliable as a church service. The convening. The minutes from the previous meeting, read aloud by a secretary, a rotating position that everyone privately found faintly demeaning, but accepted because the rotation was fair, and fairness mattered. Old business, meaning everything decided previously and not yet executed, which usually meant an uncomfortable status update from whoever had been responsible. New business, where the real energy lived, because new business meant decisions had not yet been made and positions could still be claimed. The chairwoman held genuine social authority, not legal authority, not financial authority in any personal sense, but the authority to direct the efforts of a room full of intelligent, capable, underused women who had collectively agreed the work mattered. And when a room of capable people agrees something matters, it tends to matter. You had chaired a committee yourself, and you understood exactly what it cost in invisible labor. The phone calls made in the week beforehand to test the temperature of the room. The decisions effectively made in advance, and then presented during the meeting as open questions so the outcome felt collective. The careful management of the one difficult member, the one who talked too much or objected to everything on principle, absorbed through compliment and strategic reassignment to a subcommittee where her energy could do less damage. This was organizational leadership in every functional sense of the term. In another era, it would have carried a title and a salary. Here it produced 3 decisions, an action item list, and a follow-up phone call to each member individually in the days that followed. And then, the following month, you did it all again, because the committee needed to keep existing and you were good at running it. And being good at something, even something unpaid and largely invisible, was better than the alternative of being good at nothing at all. The hour nobody quite knew what to do with somewhere between the end of lunch and the beginning of cocktail hour sat a stretch of time that the household had no real name for. The children were at school or in the nanny's hands. The morning's social obligations had been discharged. Dinner was already underway in the kitchen. The house went quiet in a way that could feel either peaceful or faintly unbearable, depending entirely on the day and on what you'd been carrying around inside you lately. Some women read during this hour, though not the frivolous novels that were considered perfectly permissible, but the kind of reading that made a husband mildly uneasy if it came up over dinner. Some played piano or painted with a dedication that had nowhere to go, since performing publicly was simply not something a woman of your position did. Some sat in a beautifully decorated living room in the company of their own thoughts and arrived, quietly, at conclusions about their lives that they then set aside immediately, because there was nowhere to actually put such conclusions. This particular quiet had a specific texture. It wasn't the quiet of exhaustion, and it wasn't the quiet of contentment either. It was the quiet of a machine paused between tasks, of a woman who had been performing since 7 that morning and had, for the moment, run out of an audience. The cook was in the kitchen. The housekeeper was somewhere upstairs. You sat in the good chair by the window in a house arranged beautifully for a life that was, in fact, happening inside it. For roughly 45 minutes, nothing at all was required of you. This was the hour women picked up books and set them down the instant someone entered the room, not because the books themselves were improper. Most were perfectly respectable, but because being caught reading in the middle of the afternoon felt like admitting you were unoccupied, and unoccupied felt like something that needed explaining, even in an empty room with no one there to ask. The garden, when there was one, often provided genuine relief during this stretch. Not the managing of it, which belonged to the gardener, but simply the sitting in it, the walking through it, the physical fact of stepping outside a house that smelled permanently of furniture polish and the cook's preparations. Women of this era described their gardens, when they described them at all, with a specificity and warmth they rarely applied to anything else in their lives. The garden asked nothing of you. It simply existed, growing on its own terms, indifferent and alive in a way almost nothing else around you was permitted to be. By 4 o'clock the children came home, or the nanny brought them down from the nursery and the quiet hour closed. The performance resumed. The book went back onto its shelf, half finished, waiting for tomorrow's version of the same quiet, which would arrive again tomorrow feeling exactly the same, full of possibility and somehow, at once, a little too heavy to be only rest. The house, as the first and loudest statement you made the home itself, was the clearest, most constant expression of a wealthy woman's competence in 1950s America, and it was judged, endlessly and without mercy, by absolutely everyone who walked through the front door. The decorator was a professional relationship that sometimes lasted decades and occasionally carried the intensity of a marriage, arguments included. You held firm opinions about the drapery fabric, the shape of the sofa legs, the precise shade of the dining room walls, and you expressed those opinions with real care, because the outcome would be on display for every person who mattered in your life for years to come. Getting the house wrong was not simply failing a test. It was closer to wearing the wrong thing to the wrong event, every single day, in front of the same audience, indefinitely. The decorator arrived with his own point of view, which was useful and also the source of nearly every disagreement. His perspective was professional, informed, and just faintly condescending, the way professionals working with people who have money but not expertise sometimes become. Your perspective was personal and specific, grounded in the fact that you were the one who would live inside these rooms every single day, and he was not. The negotiation between the two was long, courteous, and thoroughly exhausting, and at the end of it, you had curtains that were very nearly what you'd originally imagined, which counted, in this world, as a genuinely reasonable outcome. Every room in the house was expected to tell a specific story, and it fell to you to make certain the story was correct. The entrance hall announced that arriving here meant something. The living room communicated that this was a cultured household, but not a pretentious one, comfortable without ever slipping into careless. The dining room declared that meals here were occasions, that the good silver and the good crystal came out regardless of the day of the week, because a Tuesday was never a reason to lower your standards. The library quietly suggested that someone in this house actually read, and not merely the magazines that arrived monthly. The children's rooms needed to radiate warmth and order simultaneously, the visual signature of a childhood that was both privileged and carefully structured. Flowers played their own role in this ongoing production. They arrived weekly, or were arranged by your own hand from the garden if you happened to be the type, and many women very much were, treating flower arranging with something close to the seriousness of an art practice. A larger arrangement in the entrance hall, a smaller one on the dining table. A single bud in a good vase in the guest bathroom, because the guest bathroom, too, was under quiet evaluation and could not be overlooked. Guests noticed everything, even when they said nothing out loud, because direct comment was considered mildly forward. They noticed a sofa cover that had begun to look tired, drapery that had faded without correction, the absence of fresh flowers where flowers were expected. None of it was malicious. But the noticing happened regardless, and it was filed away, and the house had to keep speaking correctly in every room, at every hour, whether or not anyone was there to hear it. When the front door opened again by 6 o'clock, or whenever your husband's train or car actually brought him home, since his schedule was fixed and yours, by definition, was expected to bend around it, The house had to be entirely ready, a readiness that had in truth been under quiet preparation since roughly 4 in the afternoon. The children needed to be calm and presentable, not too wound up from the day. The ingredients for cocktails needed to be arranged and waiting. Your own appearance needed a fresh coat of attention, powder reapplied, lipstick refreshed, hair checked. Because the shift from daytime into evening required a visible effort, and that visible effort was itself a form of welcome. The magazines of the era were remarkably direct about all of this. There were entire articles instructing women on precisely how to greet a returning husband at the door, what subjects to avoid during his first hour home, how to make the household feel like a refuge from whatever pressures his day had contained. No equivalent article existed suggesting he might do the same in return, might ask what her day had actually held. The freshening up ritual ran on its own precise timing. Too early, and the lipstick had already faded by the time he walked in. Too late, and you were still finishing in the bathroom when the front door opened, communicating a lack of readiness you were determined to avoid. The goal was to be composed and pleasant, moving gracefully through the sitting room, exactly as the door swung open, the way a stage is fully set before the house lights rise. You had already been performing since 7 that morning. You would keep performing for several more hours yet. The freshening up was the only intermission nobody ever formally acknowledged. Whatever difficult meeting or frustrating colleague had filled his day, that was his to bring home and set down, because the house's job, your job, was to absorb it without adding to the weight. Whatever tension had surfaced at the committee meeting or at the luncheon table, that generally stayed unspoken, since it fell outside his domain, and crossing that particular line was understood, even when unavoidable, to be unwelcome. The actual greeting varied by marriage and by day. Some men came home warm, genuinely glad to be back, curious about the children and the evening ahead. Others came home quiet, needing the first drink and the first 20 minutes of silence before they were truly present. Some arrived carrying a kind of pressurized energy that required careful, delicate handling before it could be released into something manageable. You learned to read all of this from the sound of a briefcase being set down, and you adjusted instantly, a skill so refined it no longer registered to anyone, including you, as a skill at all. Cocktails at 6 were never really about the drinking, though the drinking was certainly happening. They functioned as a decompression ritual, a structured hinge between the day and the evening that gave the entire household permission to finally settle. The drinks tray itself was a serious piece of furniture, stocked with good scotch, good gin, the correct vermouth, glassware chosen with real intention. Making a drink correctly mattered. Being handed one mattered. A great deal of communication moved through that hour that had nothing to do with the words actually spoken. Many women of this era drank rather more than their outward composure suggested, quietly, consistently, as a private strategy for managing a life that demanded an enormous amount and acknowledged almost none of it. Your own glass, typically, held something moderate, a gin and tonic, a small glass of sherry, something that said you were participating in the ritual without admitting how much weight that ritual was sometimes carrying for you. By 7, the glass was empty or nearly so, dinner was being plated in the kitchen, and the evening had found its temperature. Whatever the day had actually contained, the committee meeting, the luncheon, the quiet, unoccupied hour, the freshening up before his return, had folded itself into the smooth surface of a household that appeared, from any conceivable angle, to be running exactly as it should. You were extraordinarily good at this. Nobody ever said so. It simply continued, night after night, without comment. The dinner party as military campaign, a dinner party hosted by a wealthy woman in 1955, was never a casual gathering thrown together on a whim. It was a production that had, in a sense, been in rehearsal since the invitations first went out 6 weeks earlier, and arguably in conceptual development since the previous dinner party, when you had quietly noted what had gone slightly wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. The menu went through several rounds of planning, adjustment, and review with the cook until it struck the correct balance, seasonally appropriate, neither too formal nor too relaxed for the specific mix of guests, whose relative social standing had already been carefully weighed against the seating chart, a puzzle entirely its own. The flowers were ordered. The silver was polished until it held light the way it was supposed to. The good china came out of its cabinet. By the time the first guest rang the bell, you had been preparing this single evening with the focus of a general assembling a campaign, and you were expected to spend the entire night appearing as though the whole thing had occurred to you casually, that afternoon, almost as an afterthought. The guest list formed the foundation everything else rested on. Get it wrong, and no amount of subsequent excellence could fully correct it. You needed the right number. 8 was considered ideal. 10 was manageable. 12 required additional staff, a longer table, and a seating chart of genuine complexity. You needed the correct mix of people, not everyone drawn from the same narrow social tier, since that produced conversation with nowhere interesting to go, but not so varied that the different tiers grew visibly self-conscious across the table from one another. You needed at least one guest capable of carrying a conversation on nearly any subject that arose. At least one couple whose marriage was stable enough not to introduce tension into the room. And crucially, no one currently in open conflict with anyone else on the list. Because if you missed an existing conflict and seated the two parties incorrectly, you would know within the first 15 minutes, and by then there was nothing left to be done about it. The seating cards themselves were drafted, rearranged, and drafted again. Husbands and wives were never seated beside one another, a rule as firm as anything found in the formal etiquette books, since married couples tended to retreat into their own private shorthand at the table, and the wider conversation lost energy the moment they did. Men and women alternated around the table. The strongest conversationalist present was placed at the table's center, where their energy could radiate outward in both directions. And the most difficult guest of the evening was seated beside you, because managing that particular person was understood without ever being said aloud to be your responsibility, and you could handle it more skillfully than anyone else at the table. The evening itself demanded a performance of serene, seemingly effortless attention. You greeted arrivals. You made introductions. You moved through the cocktail portion of the evening, ensuring no one stood alone for longer than roughly 90 seconds. At dinner, you monitored the table's temperature continuously, watching for a conversation that had lost its current, for a guest who had gone quiet in a way that required gentle rescue, for the packing of each course, for whether the cook's timing in the kitchen was holding steady under pressure. And you did all of this while participating fully in the conversation yourself, a feat of divided attention that, in almost any other professional context, would have been recognized outright as impressive. By 11, the guests had gone home. The house had gone quiet. The cook had left for the evening. The silver needed to be accounted for and the table cleared, and somewhere in your head the notes had already begun, what had worked tonight and what wanted adjusting the next time. You sat for a moment alone in the dining room after everyone had left, in the particular stillness that follows a successful evening, the candles burning down a little further, and in the warm, faintly tired satisfaction of a thing done well, you allowed yourself, briefly, to feel good about it. You had earned that much, even if no one else in the house had thought to say so. Charity work, or everything that had nowhere else to go charitable work, was never treated as optional for a wealthy woman in 1950s America. It functioned instead as the one approved channel for everything that would otherwise have had nowhere to go: organizational drive, strategic thinking, the simple human desire for a project that actually mattered, the need to feel genuinely useful in a way that a well-run household and a successful dinner party could not quite supply on their own. Women organized galas and fundraising drives and volunteer programs and full capital campaigns with the focused intensity of executives, minus the title, minus the salary, minus any cultural permission to describe what they were doing as work, which it plainly was. The results were real. The erasure of that labor as legitimate professional contribution was equally real, and most of the women carrying it out understood both facts simultaneously, without needing either one explained to them. The hospital auxiliary stood as the most serious of these charitable enterprises, and the women who ran the auxiliary boards of major hospitals in this decade were, in practice, operating organizations of genuine complexity. They coordinated hundreds of volunteers. They ran events that raised substantial sums of money. They built and maintained relationships with hospital administrators and physicians, and navigated institutional politics with the finesse of experienced negotiators. They made real decisions about resource allocation, about public communication, about community outreach. In virtually any other setting, the women doing this would have carried titles: director, manager, executive. Here they were called volunteers, technically accurate and at the same time a near-complete misrepresentation of what was actually taking place. The annual gala stood as the centerpiece of the charitable calendar, and planning it was a months-long undertaking that would have qualified as a major project in any professional setting you could name. The venue had to be secured a full year in advance, and only certain venues would do. Entertainment had to be negotiated. The program had to be designed. Tables had to be sold to donors whose willingness to give depended on an ongoing relationship that required constant cultivation, lunches, phone calls, thank you notes, the careful, sustained maintenance of a sense that their contribution was seen, valued, and had genuine consequence in the world, because a donor who felt unseen became a former donor with remarkable speed. You chaired the gala outright, or co-chaired it, which introduced its own separate diplomacy, navigating a shared leadership structure alongside someone whose organizational instincts differed from your own. And you did all of this while simultaneously managing the household, the children, the social calendar, the dinner parties, and the committee meetings, and you never once described any of it as demanding, because demanding was simply not the approved register in which women of your position were expected to discuss their own lives. At the close of the gala, the check was presented, typically by the board chair, usually a man, often the very husband of one of the women who had built the entire enterprise from the ground up. His name appeared first in the printed program. This was simply how it was done. You did not comment on it. You applauded along with everyone else, your table applauding perhaps a touch louder than most, and then you began, almost immediately, planning next year's. The weekly ritual at the Salon every Thursday, or whichever day had been claimed for the purpose. The wealthy woman of 1950s America made her way to the Salon, not primarily out of vanity, though a measured degree of vanity was certainly permitted, but because appearance maintenance functioned in this world as something close to a professional obligation, the way a lawyer maintains their credentials or a physician keeps current with the literature. The hair was set weekly because it required setting weekly. The nails were done. The brows were shaped. None of it registered as indulgence. It registered instead as the ongoing cost of doing business in a world where your appearance functioned as your first and most continuously evaluated credential. The salon also happened to be an excellent place to exchange information with other women in various states of chemical processing, all of them temporarily captive under a dryer hood, and as a result, unusually willing to talk. More genuinely useful intelligence circulated under those dryer hoods on a given Thursday than in most committee meetings combined, and the atmosphere, notably, tended to be a good deal more honest. Your relationship with your hairdresser sat among the more genuinely intimate relationships in your life, and this was no accident. The good hairdressers at the good salons were, more often than not, men, itself its own particular social arrangement, and they saw you in a state of partial construction, hair wet and uncombed, face without its full daily armor, posture relaxed in the salon chair in a way it rarely was anywhere else in your week. He knew your natural hair color, information you did not share widely. He knew how your hair behaved in humidity, what it did the week before your period, which side your part needed to fall on to compensate for the slight asymmetry in your face that only the two of you, and perhaps your husband, had ever actually noticed. You spoke to him in an easy, unguarded register you rarely used elsewhere, or you didn't speak much at all, and that was equally fine. Since a good hairdresser understood the difference between a client who needed to talk and one who simply needed 90 minutes of quiet, and treated both with the same professional respect, the manicure followed, either at the same appointment or a separate one depending on the salon's arrangement and your own preference. Nails in this decade settled on a specific shade of red, never the deepest crimson, which read as overly dramatic, and never the palest blush, which read as unfinished, but a mid-range red carrying a name like cherries in the snow, worn for years because it was correct, and correct was not something you had any particular interest in departing from. Chipped nails were not acceptable in public, and barely acceptable in private. You maintained them the same way you maintained everything else in your life, continuously, and without ever drawing attention to the maintenance itself. By the time you left the salon on Thursday afternoon, hair freshly set, nails lacquered and drying as you navigated the car door with exaggerated care to avoid smudging them, you were, once again, ready. Ready for the weekend's obligations, ready for Saturday's dinner party, ready to be seen, which in this world was the constant, unending requirement, met week after week with the quiet, determined professionalism of a woman who had simply never been offered another option. The strategic architecture of raising a daughter. Every wealthy mother of the 1950s wanted a good life for her daughter, and a good life, in this world, came with a fairly specific, largely unquestioned set of terms attached to it. The right education came first, typically a women's college or a suitable co-educational university, somewhere she would meet the right sort of people in the right kind of setting. The right engagement followed, meaning a man of appropriate background and reasonable prospects, announced within a socially acceptable window after graduation. The right wedding came next, a ceremony of scale and elegance sufficient to demonstrate the family's standing without tipping over into anything that might read as vulgar. And after that, the right subsequent life, meaning one that closely resembled her mother's own, a resemblance that was, in this world, considered a genuine compliment rather than any kind of limitation. If a daughter arrived with different ideas, professional ambitions of her own, unconventional friendships, a desire to travel and figure things out before settling down, these were generally treated as a passing phase, a temporary detour from which she would eventually correct course. Most daughters did correct course in the end. Some did not, and those daughters would spend the following decades being gently, persistently worried about at luncheons they no longer attended quite as regularly. The preparation for this life began early, and it began through proximity rather than instruction. A daughter in a wealthy household of this era learned the skills of her future the way a tradesman's child absorbed a trade, through sustained observation and gradual incorporation into the surrounding work. She watched her mother manage the household. She watched her mother receive guests, direct the staff, organize the dinner party, compose the thank you notes. From an appropriate age, she attended the same kinds of social events that would eventually constitute her own adult life, dressed correctly, taught to carry herself correctly, absorbing through sheer repetition, and the occasional gentle correction exactly how a woman of her position was expected to move through the world. Dancing lessons were standard. So was piano, at least to a competent level, since an educated woman was expected to be able to play something at a gathering without making anyone in the room uncomfortable. French, where possible, since French carried the weight of culture, and also, eventually, the European travel that awaited a well-positioned young woman during her college years. There was a word for the broader shape of this training, deportment, already faintly old-fashioned even by the 1950s, but the underlying concept remained entirely alive. Posture, poise, and a particular quality of composed attentiveness that communicated good breeding without ever needing to announce it directly. College itself functioned as the period during which a daughter's education, both academic and social, was understood to be completing itself, and the social half was never treated as secondary. The right dormitory, the right sorority where the college had them, the right friendships with young women whose families were already known quantities, and whose brothers therefore represented potential, useful introductions. The right young man, identified ideally before junior year, so that the final year of college could unfold with the comfortable security of a settled future rather than the unpleasant uncertainty of an unsettled one. You wanted, for your daughter, everything you yourself had, minus whatever parts of it had proven genuinely difficult, a complicated and not always fully conscious editing process. You wanted her secure. You wanted her loved by someone reliable. You wanted her situated inside a world you recognized and could comfortably visit yourself. What you did not quite allow yourself to want out loud, because wanting it openly would have demanded more self-examination than this decade generally encouraged, was for her to also have the parts of your own life you had quietly set aside somewhere along the way, the afternoon reading behind a closed door, the sharp mind that had no formal outlet, the things you had turned out to be good at that carried no name, and as a result, no recognition. Your daughter, you told yourself, was going to have a good life. You had already arranged a great deal of it, carefully, invisibly, in exactly the way you arranged everything else, raising a son for a success that left little room to choose while daughters were being shaped for a certain kind of life. Sons were being prepared, deliberately and relentlessly, for success. And success in this world followed an extremely specific shape that left very little room for deviation. The right preparatory school came first, followed by the right university, followed by the right club within that university. A period of military service where required, which it typically was during this era, followed by entry into a suitable career, law, finance, business, occasionally medicine, fields where the family's existing connections offered a useful head start, and from which the son was expected to go on and build something substantial in his own right. These boys were loved intensely and shaped just as intensely, and the shaping fell largely to their mothers during the household years, and to their schools and fathers once the professional track began in earnest. The tension between who a boy actually was and who he was expected to become was, in practice, nobody's officially acknowledged business, since the expectation surrounding him was so total, so long-standing, that questioning it openly would have required a kind of courage this decade did not reliably supply to anyone, least of all a teenage boy. The decision to send a son away to preparatory school was typically made when he was old enough to grasp that a major decision was being made about his life, but still too young to have any real vocabulary for objecting to it. The schools clustered mostly in New England stone buildings, wide athletic fields, a long tradition of producing a very specific type of young man, serious, capable, appropriately self-contained, who went on to attend universities that produced more of the same type, in a self-reinforcing cycle that had been running for generations with no visible sign of slowing. You visited the school together with your husband. You met the headmaster. You sent your son off each September with his trunk packed, his name sewn or taped onto everything he owned, and a composed expression you held steady until the car had pulled away, at which point you set it down. The house without him took on a different quality, quieter in a specific, boy-shaped way. You wrote letters that were cheerful and full of small news and carefully, deliberately not anxious. Because anxious letters communicated anxiety straight through to him, and anxiety in a boy at a school like that carried its own real consequences. He wrote back occasionally, in the brief, concrete style of a child who was, by his own account, fine, and simply didn't know how to say much more than that. You read those letters more times than anything else that arrived at the house that year, and filed them away in a desk drawer, and never once mentioned the drawer to anyone else in the family. The pressure placed on your son was never acknowledged as pressure, because it was, in this world, largely indistinguishable from love, And in a very real sense, it partly was exactly that. You wanted him to succeed. His father wanted him to succeed. The school wanted it. The university waiting for him wanted it. The career track ahead of him wanted it. At no point in this entire sequence was he actually asked whether success, defined in these very specific terms, was something he wanted for himself, because the question itself simply wasn't available to be asked. It was assumed, the way so much in this world was assumed, that the shape of the life being built for him was the shape of a good life, that a good life was what everyone naturally wanted, and that wanting something different was a confusion he would grow out of with time. Some of these sons did settle comfortably into the life laid out for them. Others did not, and those particular sons showed up at dinner parties in their 30s carrying a kind of muted distance that their wives learned to manage carefully, and that their own parents generally attributed to the ordinary pressures of work, which was partly true and not, in the end, the entire story. What the staff knew, and never said in any wealthy household of this decade, the people who truly understood the family best were often the ones employed inside it. The housekeeper could read the exact temperature of a marriage from the tone of a single Tuesday morning exchange. The cook could tell which family member was under strain simply from what was left uneaten on a plate. The nanny knew which child was struggling, which parent had grown quietly unavailable, and how the household's emotional weather shifted from one week to the next. These women, and they were almost always women, frequently black women in an era when domestic service remained one of the few reliably available forms of employment open to them, carried an extraordinary amount of knowledge about the private lives of the families they worked for. And they carried that knowledge in silence, because discretion functioned simultaneously as a professional requirement, and in the wider context of the world they lived in, as a genuine survival skill. The wealthy women who employed them frequently described these relationships with real warmth, and that warmth was, in many cases, entirely genuine. The imbalance of power sitting underneath it was equally genuine, and the presence of one did not cancel out the other. The housekeeper arrived each morning and moved through the house with a systematic thoroughness that amounted to its own quiet form of intelligence. She knew exactly where everything belonged and where everything currently sat, and the gap between those two states formed her daily project. She noticed what had been left out of place, a glass on the wrong surface, a book left open at a page that suggested something about whatever had been on the reader's mind, a slight disorder in the guest room hinting that a conversation had continued there well after the rest of the house had gone dark. She addressed the physical details and quietly filed the rest away in a part of her understanding of the household she never once referenced out loud. The cook came to know the family through food, a form of intimacy that runs deeper than it might initially sound. She knew which child would eat something willingly and which required strategy, the disliked vegetable folded into a sauce, the unfamiliar dish introduced alongside something reassuringly familiar. She knew the husband's preferences with the same precision his own wife did, and executed them reliably. And on the rare occasion something went slightly wrong, she could tell from how the plate came back whether it had been noticed and how much it had actually mattered. She could sense, from the level of attention suddenly requested around the menu, when the household was about to host guests who mattered, and she rose to meet it, because her own professional reputation was quietly bound up in the family's social performance, whether anyone ever acknowledged that fact or not. The relationship between a wealthy woman and her domestic staff occupied strange territory that had no single clean name attached to it. It was not friendship exactly, though it sometimes carried real warmth. It was not purely transactional either, though a transaction sat unmistakably at its core. It was a sustained intimacy conducted across a power difference so complete and so structural that it was largely invisible to the person standing on the advantaged side of it, because the most complete forms of privilege tend to feel, from the inside, like simply the natural order of things. The staff, for their part, navigated this territory with a professional sophistication that was itself, a form of uncompensated labor stacked on top of the actual work, the ongoing management of a white employer's comfort, including her feelings about the relationship itself, whether she was being kind enough, whether she felt properly respected. That management required real skill and constant judgment, with essentially no room for the kind of error the employer's position allowed her to make freely and without consequence. This was the 1950s, and these arrangements were old, and the distance between the warmth that was genuine and the justice that was largely absent was a distance that would take considerably longer than a single decade to even begin closing. The small amber bottle in the medicine cabinet in 1955, a new category of pharmaceutical product entered American medicine, and within a remarkably short span of years, came to define an entire decade for a very specific demographic. Miltown arrived first. Others followed not long after. Physicians began prescribing these mild tranquilizers in genuinely striking quantities to women who presented with a familiar cluster of symptoms: anxiety, restlessness, trouble sleeping, a vague and persistent dissatisfaction, and a nagging sense that something was wrong without being able to name precisely what it was. These women were not exaggerating or inventing their symptoms, and the doctors treating them were not, strictly speaking, wrong to offer treatment. But what was actually being managed, what those small pills were quietly smoothing over, was a way of life constructed almost entirely to minimize disruption for everyone except the person actually living inside it. The pills softened the friction. They turned down the volume on whatever interior noise had been building. They made it possible to move through the dinner party, the luncheon, the committee meeting, the long, quiet afternoon, all with the same placid, composed expression that matched a life which, viewed from a certain angle, appeared to be entirely fine. Miltown was prescribed so widely and so casually that within just a few years of its introduction it had become a kind of cultural shorthand. By the later years of the decade, it stood as the most widely prescribed drug in American history to that point. Physicians handed it out the way they might offer advice about posture, matter-of-factly, without much extended inquiry into what was actually producing the symptoms it was designed to relieve. You described the difficulty sleeping, the vague anxiety, the sense of being wound too tightly for reasons you couldn't quite put into words. The doctor nodded. The prescription was written. You filled it at a pharmacy where the pharmacist already knew your name, and it went home in a small amber bottle that took its place in the medicine cabinet beside the face cream and the aspirin, sitting there as a quiet option available on the evenings when the silence in the house grew too loud to sit with comfortably. Not every woman took them. Some did and some didn't, and the line between the two groups wasn't always the line you might expect, between women who were genuinely struggling and women who weren't. Sometimes it was simply the line between women who happened to have the right doctor and women whose doctor was still working from an older framework. Sometimes it was the line between women who trusted the medical establishment's interpretation of their own experience and women who carried a nagging sense that a pharmaceutical solution was being applied to what was really a structural problem. A fairly sophisticated read on things for the late 1950s, though hardly out of reach for intelligent women who had spent years quietly observing their own circumstances. The nerve pill, as it was sometimes called in a tone somehow both dismissive and sympathetic at once, functioned as the decade's answer to a question the decade itself was not really asking, which was what happens to genuinely capable people when nearly every outlet for that capability is removed, and they are asked, indefinitely, to perform contentment in its place. The answer, it turned out, arrived in the form of a small prescription, taken discreetly, rarely discussed at lunch, though occasionally discussed after enough wine, in the particular confidence shared between women who had been friends long enough to set the performance aside for an hour. It was, in the end, a technological solution applied to a fundamentally social problem, and it worked in the narrowest sense. The dinner parties continued, the committees kept meeting, the houses stayed maintained, The appearances held, which was, in that narrow sense, the entire point. 50 minutes that belonged entirely to you. By the middle years of the 1950s, psychoanalysis had grown sufficiently fashionable in certain wealthy circles that a woman could admit to seeing an analyst without it becoming a full social crisis. This, in itself, was genuinely new. Freudian ideas had filtered into the broader culture through the universities, through the magazines, through a general post-war appetite for examining the self. And the result was that a meaningful subset of bored, intelligent, underutilized women in very comfortable houses found themselves sitting twice a week in book-lined offices, discussing their childhoods, while a man with a notepad nodded along. What was actually said in those rooms remained private, but the simple fact that a woman was there at all functioned as a kind of signal, not that she was unstable, but that some genuine interior pressure was building, enough to require a professional outlet. Most analysts of the period, working within a strictly Freudian framework, tended to interpret that pressure as a problem residing within the woman herself. A different interpretation would arrive roughly a decade later from a writer named Betty Friedan. The analyst's office carried its own distinct atmosphere. Dark wood furniture, shelves of books, a couch, or a deep upholstered chair, depending on whether your particular analyst leaned toward strict Freudian tradition or a more conversational style. A box of tissues sat on a small side table, positioned within easy reach with the same studied casualness that governed the placement of cocktail napkins on a drinks tray, something that had clearly been thought through in advance. You arrived at precisely the correct time and departed at precisely the correct time, and the 50 minutes in between belonged, in a way almost nothing else in your week did, entirely to you. Which was itself faintly disorienting, since a room built around the sole purpose of you speaking about your own interior experience was not a room you had ever had much practice occupying. What did you actually talk about? Your mother, eventually, since it always circled back to your mother in the end. Your marriage, discussed in the careful, measured language of a woman who understood the conversation, was confidential but who had also been trained since childhood to manage what she disclosed in any room, regardless of the assurances offered. Your dreams, which the analyst found consistently significant, and which you, more often than not, found simply confusing, occasionally unsettling. Your childhood, comfortable and carefully structured, which had produced in you a set of real capabilities your current life used only partially, and a set of questions your current life did not address at all. The analyst listened. He reflected your words back to you. He asked questions that sounded simple on the surface and somehow arrived somewhere far more complicated. He did not tell you what to do, which was, in a sense, precisely the therapeutic point, and also occasionally maddening, because underneath the properly therapeutic desire for self-understanding was a simpler, more human wish for someone to just tell you what to do, or more precisely, to confirm that what you already quietly sensed about your own life was real, and not merely evidence of some personal character flaw correctable with the right attitude adjustment. What the Freudian framework offered instead was the suggestion that your restlessness traced back to your psychological development, to unresolved dynamics rooted in your earliest relationships, to the particular architecture of your unconscious mind, which could, in principle, be explored and perhaps gradually reorganized through sufficient time in analysis. This was genuinely interesting material to sit with. It was also, from the vantage point of a woman living in a beautiful house with a full staff, an active social calendar, and a persistent sense that something essential was still missing, not entirely satisfying as a complete explanation on its own. You went twice a week. You paid the fee, which was substantial. You kept every appointment the way you kept all your appointments reliably on time, and you walked back out into the afternoon, got into the car, and drove on to the next thing already waiting on the calendar, carrying with you whatever the session had stirred loose, insight, confusion, a half-formed thought that needed more room than the day currently had to give it, into an afternoon that had no particular space reserved for any of it, but which continued regardless, the way days simply do. The summer house, and the same life in a different location every summer. The wealthy family relocated, city to somewhere cooler, the Hamptons, the Cape, a lake house tucked into the mountains, a cottage on some coastal island, and this move was generally framed as a rest, a reward for the years' accumulated social labor. What it actually amounted to, from the wife's perspective, was the exact same domestic operation transplanted somewhere with considerably worse plumbing and no dependable cook. The staff configuration shifted. Some help traveled along, some did not. The children were suddenly everywhere at once and required constant management. The husband arrived only on weekends and still expected the same quality of environment he enjoyed in the city, now maintained without anything close to the same infrastructure. The social calendar, notably, did not pause. Neighboring houses had to be visited, visitors had to be received, the right people had to be seen in the right places along the waterfront, just in a slightly more relaxed register, which in practice meant precisely the same level of effort, only executed in a linen blouse instead of a cocktail dress. The move itself amounted to a genuine logistical operation that began weeks ahead of the actual departure, deciding what traveled and what stayed behind in the city. Restocking a kitchen from scratch, since the summer house's pantry sat empty and untouched all winter and required full replenishment each June. Reviewing and expanding the children's summer wardrobes, since children have an inconvenient habit of growing in directions their existing clothes no longer accommodate. Sorting through summer reading, summer sporting equipment, and the summer's own social calendar, invitations sent, invitations received, arranged well before arrival so you weren't left simply reacting to whatever the season happened to produce on its own. The lake, or the beach, or the mountain air genuinely was restorative, and it's worth saying plainly because the experience wasn't devoid of real pleasure. There was something in the loosening of the city's tight structure that even the most disciplined, organized woman felt as genuine relief. The children could run freely. The schedule relaxed its grip by some noticeable degree. Evenings arrived earlier and quieter, and the darkness carried stars the city simply didn't offer. You sat on the porch after dinner with a drink in hand in a way that felt easier than the city's version of the same gesture. The surrounding sound water or wind rather than traffic, and for a few hours something in you that usually stayed braced against something eased, just slightly. But the weekends, when husbands arrived by train or by car from the city, tightened everything back into shape. The house had to be ready for his arrival the same way it always had to be ready, which meant the children needed managing into a presentable state. The meals had to be organized, and the weekend social obligations, neighbors over for Saturday dinner, the club for Sunday lunch, had to be executed with the same underlying precision the city demanded, only now with a screen door that never quite closed properly and a cook who had stayed behind in the city. Her role now filled by your own effort supplemented by whatever local help could be arranged, which was never entirely equivalent. By Labor Day, you were ready to return, not because the summer itself had been unpleasant, but because the city's infrastructure simply made everything easier. And easier was not a small thing when the entire operation, wherever it happened to be located, remained your responsibility alone. You packed the house back up, closed the shutters, arranged for the caretaker, and drove home with the children, the luggage, and the summer's accumulated evidence of a life lived largely outdoors. And the apartment sat waiting, cool and still and precisely as you'd left it. And for roughly 24 hours, before the full schedule resumed its grip, you moved through it with a particular quiet gratitude for floors that didn't creak and plumbing that simply worked, and a cook who would be back at her post come Monday morning. The magazines that told you exactly who to be if you wanted to understand precisely what was expected of a wealthy American woman in 1953, you didn't have to look very far. The magazines told you everything, issue after issue, month after month. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, House Beautiful, Ladies' Home Journal, Town and Country. These publications delivered, with remarkable consistency, a detailed vision of feminine excellence. The correct body, the correct wardrobe, the correct home, the correct attitude toward your husband, your children, your social obligations, and somewhere further down the list, yourself. The advice columns fielded reader questions about every conceivable domestic and relational difficulty, with a serenity that suggested the answers were obvious, which, within the closed set of assumptions the magazine itself operated inside, they perhaps were. What the magazines did not address, what sat conspicuously absent from every issue, was the question of whether the entire arrangement made sense in the first place, because that particular question simply was not available yet in 1953. It would arrive later. In the meantime, there were instructions, and the instructions were extraordinarily detailed. The fashion magazines specified exactly what to wear down to a degree of precision that left very little room for personal interpretation. Not simply the silhouette, the nipped waist, the full skirt, the structured shoulder that defined the decade's overall shape, but the correct accessories for that silhouette, the correct occasions for those accessories, and the correct way to move inside the finished ensemble, so the whole effect read as effortless rather than assembled. The models photographed for these pages stood with a particular quality of arranged stillness that communicated wealth and composure at once, and the underlying aspiration was never to look like the model exactly, but to produce the same feeling she communicated, a woman with everything correctly arranged and entirely untroubled by the arranging. The home magazines were, if anything, even more granular. The proper way to set a table for 8 guests. The correct approach to preparing a guest bedroom, from the quality of the linen down to the placement of the reading lamp, down to the small, deliberate touch of a glass of water and a single flower on the nightstand, signaling that your guests were expected and their comfort had been anticipated in advance. The appropriate hostess gift and the proper way to present it. The management of domestic staff, how to hire correctly, how to correct an error without cruelty, how to let someone go in a manner that was firm without tipping into unkindness, since unkindness registered, even behind closed doors, as its own form of social failure. All of it arrived monthly, illustrated in beautiful photography, written in a breezy, authoritative prose style that made the instructions feel less like rules and more like the simple, natural behavior of women who already understood things properly. The advice columns were where the human cost occasionally surfaced, compressed and redirected into the careful language of letters written for publication. A letter about a husband who had grown distant, answered with advice about creating a warmer domestic atmosphere. A letter about a woman feeling restless and without clear purpose, answered with advice about finding meaning through service to family and community. Letters that described, in the guarded language available to a woman writing to a magazine in 1954, something that didn't yet have a proper name, met with answers that addressed nearly everything except that unnamed thing itself. You read the magazines, as did nearly everyone in your circle. They arrived at the house monthly and were read and discussed at the luncheon table, and some of their advice was followed to the letter, some of it quietly adapted, and some of it set aside entirely by women who already knew better through lived experience, though they wouldn't have said so out loud, since saying so would have required a framework that simply hadn't made its way into print yet, and wouldn't for another decade. In the meantime, the magazines kept arriving, the instructions kept coming, the photographs stayed beautiful, and the women pictured inside them looked, every single month, perfectly, serenely, completely fine. The right clubs and the machinery behind them, membership in the correct clubs, was never merely a social convenience. It functioned as structural, foundational, the largely invisible architecture holding the entire social world together. The country club, the city club, the women's club, the garden club, the yacht club where geography allowed for one. Entry into these institutions ran through a process of invitation and vetting controlled entirely by existing members, a process simultaneously casual in manner, and underneath that casualness, brutally precise in its judgment. The wrong family background could disqualify an applicant outright. The wrong profession could as well. And in certain clubs, in certain cities, the wrong religion, most often meaning Jewish, functioned as automatic disqualification, stated plainly in the membership criteria of the era and defended, without much visible embarrassment, by people who considered themselves entirely cultured. The women navigating these systems were, for the most part, operating inside a structure they had not personally designed and rarely thought to question, since it had simply always been there. And things that have always been there have a way of appearing natural even when they are, on close inspection, simply old. The application process for a significant club carried no formal shape at all, nothing resembling a job application, no interview in the ordinary sense, no stated criteria you could measure yourself against. Instead, there was a proposer, a current member willing to put your name forward, staking their own social credibility on your suitability, and a seconder, a second current member endorsing that proposal. Then came a period during which the membership committee, a group whose specific composition was itself socially significant, weighed the application without explaining its deliberations to anyone outside the room. The decision arrived eventually by letter. Acceptance meant you were in. Rejection meant you were not, no explanation offered, and asking for one would only have confirmed whatever concern had produced the rejection in the first place. The country club in summer was where the children swam under a lifeguard's supervision, while you played tennis with women whose own membership predated yours by decades, or whose membership was more recent, and whose position in the club's internal social hierarchy was, as a result, still being quietly established, sometimes alongside your own. Lunch at the club carried a different texture from the restaurant luncheon. More relaxed in setting, less formal in its specific table obligations, but no less loaded with social information underneath the surface. Who sat with whom? Who arrived together? Who waved from across the terrace, and who instead crossed the entire lawn to come over in person? Exclusion from these clubs operated in the specific, quietly painful way that exclusion from anything structuring your entire world tends to operate. You weren't prevented from living your life exactly, but you were prevented from living it in the particular way your peers lived theirs, and the gap between your world and their world showed up in small, accumulating daily signals that eventually added up to something genuinely difficult to carry. Families newly arrived in a city, or new to the relevant tier of wealth, or carrying some aspect of background the membership committee found disqualifying, experienced this gap and navigated it with varying degrees of grace, and varying degrees of quiet internal cost. You, for your part, were already inside the clubs. You had been proposed by the right person at the right moment, the letter had arrived, and you had joined. From inside that membership, the exclusions themselves remained essentially invisible, in the specific way comfort always renders its own preconditions invisible. You didn't see the mechanism at work, because the mechanism happened to be working in your favor, and mechanisms working in your favor have a way of feeling like simply the natural order of things, rather than the deliberate operation of a system someone had built, and which could, in principle, have been built entirely differently. Managing the slow business of aging for a wealthy woman in 1950s America, aging was treated as something that happened primarily to other people, or, more precisely, something to be managed with sufficient vigilance that it did not visibly happen to you. Face creams had been in steady use since the 1930s. Posture had been maintained through decades of quiet self-consciousness. Weight was monitored constantly and without much discussion, since extra weight registered in these circles as its own form of social failure, a visible suggestion that you had simply stopped trying, managed instead through careful portion control and occasionally more aggressive dieting that nobody discussed openly. Hair was colored where necessary, which it usually was, and colored carefully enough to look entirely natural, since admitting to the coloring amounted to admitting that time was winning, and that was not an admission you were prepared to make. You intended to keep showing up at luncheons in the correct shoes until someone physically pried them off you. The face cream regimen, established early, was never really departed from. Cleansing cream at night, toner, a heavier night cream that carried the faint scent of roses and the persistent optimism of believing whatever you applied at 11 would show a measurable difference by morning. A lighter day cream with a hint of coverage. Eye cream applied with the ring finger in a specific dabbing motion you'd read about in a magazine back in the early 1940s and had been performing faithfully ever since. And always the neck, since the neck, you'd been told early on and taken seriously, was where a woman's age truly gave itself away, and you had applied everything meant for your face to your neck as well for the better part of 20 years, a preventive campaign whose results were, by most measures, genuinely impressive. The matter of weight carried more difficulty. The ideal silhouette of the decade required a defined waist, which called for either a natural tendency in that direction or a sustained, disciplined relationship with your own appetite, never discussed openly as discipline, since discipline implied visible effort, and the entire point was for the result to appear natural. You ate carefully at every meal. You left food on the plate. You declined the bread basket or took a small piece and stopped there. At dinner parties, you ate enough to be polite and not one bite more than that, navigating the dessert course with the smooth, practiced expertise of someone who had been managing that particular moment for 30 years. Exercise wasn't discussed in these terms at all, not yet carrying its own dedicated language, culture, or equipment the way it would in later decades. You simply moved. You walked. You played tennis at the club during the season, which was genuinely enjoyable and also, conveniently, kept the arms and general posture in shape. You climbed the stairs in your own house rather than imagining some easier alternative. You stood correctly, itself a sustained physical effort, spine straight, shoulders back, head level, because posture functioned as a visible, ongoing commitment to not giving in. Giving in simply wasn't available as an option. A woman who visibly stopped managing her appearance was communicating something about her relationship to her own life, and that communication registered clearly with everyone around her, carrying real social consequences even when nobody ever stated them out loud. So you continued. The creams, the salon, the tennis, the carefully managed plate. You aged because aging was never actually preventable, but you aged in the approved direction, gradually, gracefully, with your standards fully intact, and you carried it off as though it cost you nothing at all, which was, in the end, perhaps the most demanding performance of everything you did. 11 o'clock and the woman underneath somewhere around 11 when the house had gone quiet, the children long asleep, the last dinner guest already driven home, your husband reading or already drifting off. There arrived a moment that belonged entirely to the woman of the house. She sat at her vanity and removed the earrings and the bracelet, the careful face she had first put on at 7 that morning. The cream went on. The hair came down. The robe replaced the evening clothes, and for a few minutes in the privacy of her own bathroom, inside a beautifully decorated house, in the right neighborhood, surrounded by the right family and the right life, she existed entirely outside of all of it, in a quiet that felt either restful or, depending on the particular night, considerably harder to sit inside. Some nights it was peaceful. Other nights the quiet carried a texture that was harder to settle into, a kind of accumulated weight with no name attached to it, never spoken about, set aside again by morning when the alarm sounded, and the performance simply resumed. And there was, mercifully, always too much left to do to spend much time thinking about it. The earrings came off first, good ones, pearl or small diamonds, placed into the jewelry box with the practiced motion of someone who had performed this exact gesture 10,000 times before, because she had. The necklace unclasped, the bracelet set down beside it. The rings came last, and removing them carried its own particular weight. The engagement ring and the wedding band laid together in the small dish that existed on the vanity for exactly this purpose. And something about setting them down each night felt like laying aside the most visible markers of your identity, together with the day that had spent itself organizing around them. The face came off in stages. Lipstick blotted onto a tissue first. Then the cold cream worked in small, even circles across the forehead, the cheeks, the neck, always the neck, and finally removed with a damp cloth. What emerged from that process was the face without its credentials, the one that had existed before the performance began each morning, and after it ended each night, the one your husband had, in truth, stopped really looking at years earlier. The way you eventually stop noticing something that has simply always been there. You looked at it yourself briefly, not with vanity exactly, but with a kind of practical inventory, the same attention you brought to anything else in the house requiring upkeep. Is this holding up? What does it need? What's the honest assessment? The honest assessment most nights was that you were somewhere in your 40s and looked it, and had managed those years into something still, by the relevant standard, acceptable, and acceptable was the register you lived inside and had made a private peace with mostly. The hair coming down was the final gesture, and the physical release of it carried a weight slightly out of proportion to the small act itself. The pins removed one by one. The brush pulled through. The hair that had been carefully arranged since 7 that morning fell into its own natural shape, softer, less deliberate, and in some strange way, more genuinely yours than anything you had presented to the world for the entire day that had just ended. You turned off the bathroom light. The house settled into the particular quiet of a home where everyone else has already gone to sleep, and you alone remain briefly, privately awake. You lay down, and the day finally released its grip, and somewhere inside that loosening you were, simply, a person in a bed without the schedule, without the wardrobe, without the carefully calibrated performance of a life that appeared, by every visible measure, to be exactly what it was supposed to be. Tomorrow it would all begin again. But for now, just this. The decade that did not end cleanly, the 1950s, never really ended in one clean, decisive moment. Like most decades, it simply blurred into the 1960s, gradually at first and then, all at once, with things that had been quietly building for years finally arriving together in a form that surprised almost everyone except the people who had been carrying the pressure inside themselves the whole time. The wealthy women who had spent a decade running hospital auxiliaries with the focused intensity of executives began hearing, more and more, about women doing similar work for actual salaries. The daughters who had been raised and prepared to find husbands during college started coming home with different ideas entirely, ideas about other possibilities. A book landed in 1963, written by a woman who had gone out and interviewed suburban housewives directly, and found, to no one's real surprise except apparently everyone's, that a great many of them were not, underneath the surface, entirely fine. The book moved quietly between women at luncheon tables and was read behind closed doors during those long, quiet afternoon hours, and the recognition it produced was not always comfortable. But it was, for the women who read it, entirely unmistakable. The life that had been described to them their whole lives as a privilege and a comfort turned out, for many of the women actually living it, to be something considerably more complicated than that description had ever allowed. And now, finally, there were words available for it. The change didn't arrive uniformly, and it didn't arrive all at once. It moved differently through different women, depending on age, temperament, and each woman's particular relationship to the specific life she had spent years building. For some, it arrived through their own daughters, who came home from college in the mid-1960s talking about things they had read, asking questions about their mother's choices in a tone that was not quite accusatory and not quite admiring either, but somewhere uncomfortably between the two. For others, it arrived through the newspapers, which had begun reporting on things that had never been reported on before: organized protest, public demands, women speaking collectively about their shared situation in a new grammar that suddenly made the whole thing legible in a way it simply hadn't been before. The luncheon table registered this shift before almost anything else did, because the luncheon table had always been where the culture's temperature was taken in this particular world. By the early 1960s, the temperature had noticeably shifted. There were women at the table quietly considering a return to school. There were women whose daughters had taken jobs after marriage and kept them, something that would have counted as mildly scandalous only a few years earlier and now registered as merely interesting. There were women who mentioned, with a careful casualness that concealed just how significant the mention actually was, that they had been reading something lately, or thinking about something, or wondering about something. And the other women at the table received these small admissions with a quiet recognition that was, in itself, its own form of communication, a signal passed silently across the tablecloth that said, "Yes, me too," though it would never once be phrased that directly. The husbands, for the most part, did not notice the shift happening until it had already become significant, which was, in fairness, partly their own doing, and partly the natural result of a situation in which their wives' interior lives had never been particularly visible to them in the first place, not because those interior lives had been deliberately hidden, but because the entire structure of the shared marriage had been built, from the very beginning, to keep the domestic and the interior firmly separated, and the husband, by design, simply hadn't been given much reason to cross that line with any real frequency or attention. What followed is, of course, a much longer story than the one told tonight. It runs through the rest of the 1960s and well into the 1970s, carrying with it a great deal of argument, a great deal of reorganization, real and lasting transformation, and alongside all of that, a considerable amount of loss and confusion too, because a transformation of this size never arrives cleanly, and it never leaves everyone immediately better off. But the beginning of it, the very first quiet stirrings of it, sat right here. Inside the ordinary quiet afternoons of the 1950s, inside the books read behind closed doors, inside the half-formed questions that surfaced at the vanity at 11 at night, in a restlessness that simply had no name yet, until, eventually, it did. The women who had spent those years running the committees and organizing the galas, managing entire households and raising children and maintaining, day after day, the appearance of effortless contentment, had, without fully realizing it at the time, been quietly practicing something all along. Not merely performing a life, but building an entire set of real capabilities, organizational, relational, strategic, deeply communicative, that were, in time, about to find themselves a considerably larger stage than the one they'd been handed. In their own particular way, they had always been ready. The wider world was simply, slowly, and not without resistance, only just beginning to notice. The end of a very long day, and so here you are, at the close of a very long day that began at 7 that morning with pin curls and cold cream and a house dress pressed the night before, and has finally arrived, somewhere near 11, at the earrings sitting in their small dish and the hair at last let down, and the quiet of a house that has been performing steadily since sunrise, finally allowed simply to be still. You managed the breakfast and the staff and the children's departure for school. You sat through the committee meeting and the luncheon, where everything that actually mattered happened somewhere in the spaces between sentences. You refreshed your lipstick before he came home. You arranged the cocktails exactly as they needed arranging. You carried the dinner through to its end with precisely the right expression at precisely the right moments, and a seating chart nobody at the table ever noticed, because it had worked, and things that work in this world are, by their very nature, invisible. You did all of it. You did it well. And nearly all of it went entirely without acknowledgement, because that had always been the arrangement, and the arrangement was old, and old things have a peculiar way of feeling permanent even once they no longer are. But here is what stayed true underneath all of the performance and the schedule and the perfectly coordinated accessories. These women were never fragile. They were never simply decorative. They were not quietly waiting around for the world to grant them permission to become something. They already were something, capable, strategic, deeply perceptive, quietly formidable in ways the surrounding culture didn't have adequate language for, and so, mostly, never bothered trying. They ran entire organizations without ever holding a formal title. They managed households of genuine complexity without receiving anything close to the acknowledgement that complexity actually deserved. They raised children who would, in time, go on to change the world in ways their mothers could only partly imagine. And they did every bit of it while maintaining an appearance of serenity so complete that the effort sitting underneath it remained essentially invisible. Itself, a genuinely extraordinary achievement, even if it happened to be an achievement given entirely in service of a system that did not always serve them back in equal measure. They were also, some of them, on certain quiet afternoons, in certain quiet rooms, lonely in a very specific way, the particular loneliness of a person whose interior life holds more rooms than the surrounding life was ever built to enter. That loneliness was real, and it deserves to be named clearly, without apology, all these decades later, by people falling asleep tonight in homes with reliable heating, and medicine that actually works, and the entirely unrestricted use of their own ambition. So tonight, as you settle further into your own bed, in a life that would look almost unrecognizable to a woman living in 1953, whatever career you may or may not have chosen, whatever freedom you carry to say aloud, at your own dinner table, exactly what you actually think, without first quietly recalibrating it for the room, perhaps spare a small, quiet thought for the women who came before you. In their silk robes and their correct shoes, managing absolutely everything with one hand, while the other hand held on, just barely, to the thread of a self they were never quite permitted to fully follow. They held that thread for a very long time. And eventually it led somewhere. Sleep well tonight. You've more than earned it.